the history is the history, and it's just very deeply embedded in how we live and how we breathe in society today.
Yeah,
Everything from, if you, so I live in Chicago, right? And if I simply start walking, pretty much in any direction,
yes,
the history of how did we get to this place in terms of zoning and who lives on the land and who's rich
sure.
and who's poor and what color are they, is etched in our choices over how we decided to allocate land in our past, right?
Yes.
In the American past. And frankly, you can meet plenty of folks who are from other countries as well, and they all have pasts that are also linked very deeply to the land. And so it's something that we see all the time. And I think
Yeah.
you're right that we don't necessarily want to, or at least the Trump administration doesn't want to talk about it in the terms of, whether it be race or gender or what have you. But those are just, they're there in the history. They're deeply embedded in the history.
This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Professor Michael Albertus, but I'm going to call Mike from now on, although Michael's what is on his book. So you need to look at that when you want to buy the book in a bookstore. Mike is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and he studies how countries associate opportunity and well-being among their citizens and consequences for this for society, why some countries are democratic and others aren't. But what we're talking about today is his newest book, which I think came out in February or January.
January, yeah.
Yeah, called Land Power: Who Has It, Who Doesn't, and How That Determines the Fate of Societies. So this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm asking you to please subscribe right now on YouTube and become a subscriber, where we go out live, and then this stays on YouTube for a long time. And also to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And that's the boilerplate. So, Mike, I finished your book this morning. You emailed me. I was about 2 hours away from done, and you said, "Are we on today?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm still reading your book." So, thank you. It's a good book. It's a very interesting read. So, the first thing I want to ask you before we get into it, and I have copious notes here I want to talk to you about, is in terms of the context in which you wrote that book. When did you begin that project? And I know it was published in February, but when did you finish it? And I guess this isn't a loaded question, but my real question is, did you finish it in the context of the re-election of Donald Trump again?
Mm.
Because of course, though the book is not a political book in a way, in another way it is, because the context in which this book comes out is about as antithetical to what your book says as you could get. In other words, I don't think you're going to be arrested by ICE anytime soon, but the tone of the book, and this is not a criticism, by the way, but it's the kind of thing that Tucker Carlson and JD Vance and these other people rail against in terms of a look at Western civilization, colonization, and these other things. Things jump out off the page in terms of the way land use and sharing of land and so forth. Examples from Bolivia, you name it, that has empowered women. The kind of thing that they don't want anybody to talk about is in part what your book is about. So my question is, when did you start this project? Where were we politically when you began it? Because it's come out in the middle of a shitstorm.
Completely. I started this project years and years ago. I mean, the deepest roots actually go back to my dissertation, and work during graduate school that really got me interested in these questions about how society is structured and
Yeah,
how deeper forces kind of inform that.
yeah,
But the actual writing of the book, really began, probably about 3 years ago or so, and it was wrapped up, tied with a bow, sent off to the publisher. I believe it was about 1 year ago. I think it was in
yeah.
April of last year. So it was before all this
It was
happened,
before all
right?
that. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was before all this happened. Although, I wouldn't have written it any differently
No, I'm
because,
not saying you
yeah,
would have. I mean, why would you?
yeah,
Facts are facts. But the thing is,
yep,
I'm just saying, I mean, I'll give you a weird analogy. I grew up in an evangelical right-wing family. I fled it when I was in my 20s and 30s. But the context of my work, when I write fiction novels like Portofino, Saving Grandma, and so forth, that were kind of drawn on my early years of childhood. But when I started writing memoir about 20 years ago, Um, in the context of a memoir I wrote basically on my journey out of the evangelical fold and my father's rise as a new religious right leader and all that stuff, I thought, okay, who's going to be interested in this? This is not happening anymore. Hillary Clinton will be the next president, probably, that kind of thing. And of
Hmm.
course, the stupid thing is now I try to talk, if the media calls me or, I get a call from MSNBC or something when they were still a going concern a couple years ago, it was to talk about nothing else but this. So the thing that surprised me was what I thought would become a moot point and sort of just my past history for people who came out of that background
Hmm.
has become the thing that the whole political scene began revolving around when a bunch of white evangelical Christians elected Donald Trump in terms of his majority. Well, I feel the same about your book because the challenges your book laid down, far from being a sort of an esoteric academic consideration, basically by not much of an extension or jump, take on the entire philosophy of the Trump regime, if you can put it that way. And you obviously didn't write it for that reason, but it kind of puts your book in a weird context.
I mean, that's true. I mean, I think though that, the history is the history, and it's just very deeply embedded in how we live and how we breathe in society today.
Yeah.
Everything from, if you so I live in Chicago, right? And if I simply start walking, pretty much in any direction,
Yes.
the history of how did we get to this place in terms of zoning and who lives on the land and who's rich
Sure.
and who's poor and what color are they is etched in our choices over how we decided to allocate land in our past, right?
Yes.
In the American past. And frankly, you can meet plenty of folks who are from other countries as well, and they all have pasts that are also linked very deeply to the land. And so it's something that we see all the time. And I think
Yeah.
you're right that we don't necessarily want to, or at least the Trump administration doesn't want to talk about it in the terms of, whether it be race or gender or what have you. But those are just, they're there in the history. They're deeply embedded in the history. And there's also, I will say that there's been a really interesting new set of twists that have come about since the book was published, things that I certainly didn't anticipate. Things like, oh, claims for trying to take Greenland by hook or by crook, we're going to get
Yeah.
Greenland, or maybe the Panama Canal, or turn Gaza into, Riviera the
I'm
Middle
rooting
East.
for Switzerland because I want to get back to Zermatt as a citizen because
There
I
you
grew up
go.
in Switzerland.
There you
Let's
go.
get
So,
Switzerland.
so there's all these other things that, have also become oddly relevant in ways that we haven't thought about in a long time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's why, I mean, it's a weird place to start, but it was kind of eerie reading your book because it was kind of like, wait a minute. Isn't this kind of ripped from the headlines in terms of, isn't this what the Heritage Foundation is trying to shut down? Or isn't this exactly what, so there's a kind of a weird echo, like you're reading the book with music playing too loud or something, because there's a whole nother scenario going on, which basically confirms, but also underlines the importance of what you're writing about. And I appreciated the book for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that you are an academic, and I don't know who published the book. I didn't look, but I'm guessing it's an academic press, right? Who
This is
published it?
actually Basic Books. So
Oh yeah,
private.
Basic Books
So
did, and
yeah,
they're
so it's
part of
very private.
Hachette.
Yep.
They're
Yep.
part of Hachette. And
That's
I,
right.
by the way, I published with a couple of Hachette's people too. But in
Yep.
any case, very fortunately for your reader, you've written a book that's very readable. It's certainly not an academic book, although it may have roots in a dissertation. It reads like you actually want someone to understand what you're saying, which is nice.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. No, I did. I wrote and rewrote, and I'm 3 or 4 books past the dissertation at this point. So the technical stuff is there, and
I
it
know.
all comes here, the big, broad sort of stories about the
Yeah,
sweet.
so let me just talk about let me set up by reading the table of contents for people, and then we'll dive in. Part one, Lands Without Masters. Chapter one, Land and Power in Human History. Chapter two, The Great Reshuffle. By the way, did you come up with the term reshuffle? Because I haven't seen it before. Maybe that's just I don't read enough about this.
No, no, that's my term.
Yeah, I thought it was because I'd never seen it before, but I think it's brilliant. I mean, The Great Reshuffle, it's great. I love it.
Yeah. Great.
Um, it also sort of takes an ideological sting out of it because you don't call it the Great Invasion or the Great Theft, the reshuffle, because that shows it's an ongoing process anyway.
That's right.
The Great Reshuffle, Part Two, How Land Made Our Greatest Problems. Chapter Three, Lands Divided by Race. Chapter Four, This Land is Man's Land. Land This land is man's land. Chapter 5, the disappearing wilderness. Chapter 6, the underdevelopment playbook. Part 3, land as a solution. Chapter 7, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward development. Chapter 8, one small step for women. Chapter 9, reclaiming nature. Chapter 10, the return of dispossess, and then the conclusion. And one thing, I know this is out of sequence, but one point that I wanted to jump to that I had not really paid attention to, although I've done enough reading, and I grew up in Switzerland. I went to boarding schools in England. I moved to the States. I grew up as a fundamentalist evangelical. I've become something very different. And I'm a writer myself. So basically, I have a kind of luckily for your particular book, you happen to have written a book where I have enough general knowledge so I can really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Not that you have to be a specialist, and I don't claim any special knowledge, but I got it. But one of the things I hadn't thought about that you used some very good examples on, and then we'll get back into dealing with it in a more orderly way, is this idea of how land use and land ownership has actually so deeply affected women. And that's not something I'd ever thought of specifically. Obviously, how it affects all humans. So we'll get back into the book, but I just want to go there first because we have a lot of women that we talk to on this podcast. I was going to say program, whatever this is. A lot of authors and so forth. But I think that with some of the women who are watching this particular podcast, you're going to be fascinated because one of the main themes that runs through land power is how gender equality is directly affected by the subject of Mike's book. So without me going to the actual passages, why don't we talk about that for a minute in a little bubble and then get into the book proper?
Sure. Yeah. Let me give you an example. The example that comes from Canada and Canadian history, right? So
Yeah.
Canada, like the United States, had something analogous to our Homestead Act, right? Where it basically settled the entire Canadian West by doling out land, in 160 acre parcels and the like. And in Canada, unlike in the United States had some restrictions on women, but Canada explicitly barred single women from homesteading. And so when they created this Homestead Act in 1872, and then, doled out hundreds of millions of acres of land, the entire Canadian West, over the course of the next 75 years or so, almost all of that land was granted to men. As opposed to women. And women who partnered with men, if those partnerships broke up, if their husbands died, if they left, whatever, they oftentimes did not have access to that land. So they would be left high and dry and would have to try and make their way back out to somewhere in order to not end up destitute and the like. And what's interesting is that you see that pattern of how land was allocated to men instead of women. You see that etched into society in terms of the health of women compared to men, the income of women compared to men, upward mobility of women compared to men for decades and decades and decades, up until very recently. And that's, one example of many that you can think of across the world of ways in which, simply titling land to men, giving land to men, to the exclusion of women, actually really impacted, household relationships and gender relations more generally.
Yeah, one specific you get into, and forgive me if I've mixed my countries up, but like a T-shirt I want to wear because when I had my 70th birthday, and I didn't actually make it, but I'm thinking of it as I'm old, don't fuck with me. So that's always my excuse. I can just say, hey, for an old guy, I can remember a lot. But I think you had a fairly detailed analysis in this particular thing about women and land power in Bolivia. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So we want to talk about that a little bit because I found that whole section of your book so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, this is another example of, Bolivia is a fairly traditional society in terms of gender relations, and and the country inherited from its colonial past this extremely grossly unequal distribution of land. Basically, a very small number of people that could trace their family past to the colonial era held land, vast tracts of land, and everybody else basically worked for them. And they were more or less bought and sold with the land too. Right? So it was really this kind of serf-like relationship. And that ran up until the 1950s. And there was a revolution in Bolivia in 1952. And that began a process of breaking up those land holdings and granting them to people who worked on the land directly, right? And but in the process of doing that, again, like in Canada, they basically gave all the land to men, right? So
Yeah.
men held access to land, women didn't have access to land, and that
Yeah.
that exacerbated these big gender disparities, right? And then when Evo Morales came into power in the mid 2000s, he brought with him, he was elected on the back of a social movement, a
Sure.
rural movement, but that also incorporated women directly, so that the Speaker of the House, effectively the Congress, became a peasant woman. And what they did is that they decided to, there was also, when land was redistributed or reallocated in Bolivia after 1952, there was also not property rights typically that were
Yeah.
given to people, strong property rights.
Yeah.
So what Evo Morales and his movement did was that they went about giving people more security to their land through titling the land, but
Yeah.
then they would actually title land jointly to men and women within households. And so
Hmm.
all of a sudden, in a very short span of time, women got direct access to
Yes.
land. And then they got greater participation, political participation, social participation, respect, and the like because of that. And so it was a
Yeah.
real big transformation in a very traditional society.
Yeah, and I love that section of the book. Now I forget the woman's name. There's where my old thing comes in. What was her
Sylvia
name?
Lazarte was her name,
Yeah, yeah.
was the woman who led that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you talk about her in some depth. Um, so let me talk about the scope of the book here. And there were some things in it that I was grateful for, in the sense that, you're sort of a creature of the left. I mean, as I am, I guess. But of course, you have a very good and not harsh, but realistic judgment on some land distribution or redistribution. For instance, what happened with Stalin, China, et cetera. So I just want to say this, because I sort of not joke, but I talked at the beginning about how, ICE hasn't arrested you yet, but your book runs counter to that. But people need to know that, I think reading between the lines, you're someone that I put it this way, your book comes off as someone who has written it from not a leftist position, because you're more neutral than that, but definitely that's, you're from there. But I would just say it's very fair when it comes to looking at the fact that this is not a left-right issue. And you couch it, I think, very wisely early in the book by talking about the hunter-gatherer society. And one passage I really loved, and actually I'm going to quote it in something I'm writing because it's such a good summary, and I'll put a footnote in so they know who I stole it from. But you really gave a great synopsis for a couple pages of this sort of transition from the hunter-gatherer, not landless, but not land owning people. And then you sort of detail. So I want you to just do that for us off the top of your head, in terms of how it went, from agriculture changed things, then people staying in areas that are more, agriculturally friendly, climate wise. There's a food supply, then they start like owning things, and then of course you go into cities and all the rest of it. But I don't want to read the passage. I'd rather have you tell it to me, and that is, talk about how we went from hunter gatherers, who, by the way, in a really good book we've talked a lot about on this program, The Old Way, by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who in the 1950s lived with the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert with their parents. Her dad founded Raytheon, and for some weird reason, you ought to check the book out, by the way. She was 19 and she lived with the Bushmen for a year, and no one else from outside their community had ever been there, and certainly no white person ever. And this was just before the South Africans took over Southwest Africa, totally, came into Namibia and destroyed what little the Germans had left untouched. So it's a sad story, but the hunter-gatherers she knew are the ones you describe. They were very generous. They took care of each other. Women were treated very equally with men. And by the way, all her notes were made in the 50s, before, quote, modern feminism. She doesn't have an axe to grind. This is just what she found. So I kind of took that as my departure point in your book. And then what she doesn't do, because that's not what her book is about, is what you do. So I want you to answer this question, because it's well answered in the book. How did we go from that to land ownership becoming this kind of oppressive land grab, including indentured servitude and all the rest? There's a progression there through industrialization.
Yeah.
So 10,000 years ago, people weren't doing this. Now they are. Give us the broad sweep.
Yeah, it's remarkable when you think about it in the sweep of human history. I mean, 98% of human history, 99% of human history is a history in which people had these diffuse kind of more territorial sort of relationships with the land, but
Yeah.
there was not the ownership of land as we think about it today, right? There wasn't
Yeah.
anything like Western modern notions of exclusive alienable property rights, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, plus there were just a few million people on the land.
Yes, it was
10,000
a lot less.
BC, I mean, there was maybe 5 million people on the land, right? So less than
Yeah.
the population of New York City and on the entire globe.
Yeah.
And and so there was this, people had moved, seasonally with herds of animals and all kinds of stuff like that. And so there was this general sense of territoriality and maybe belonging to the land, but not the ownership of land. That started to change around 10,000 BC with the rise of sedentary societies.
Yeah.
And then it deepened around 5,000 BC with the rise of year-round agricultural towns. When people
Yeah.
could finally, for the first time in human history, sustain themselves the entire year round on agriculture, right?
Yeah.
And what that meant then is that, in order to do that, you've got to create enough food in one particular spot, right? So
Hmm.
you're generating surplus. You're able to then live on the land all year round. And what that does for the first time in human history is it enables people to, as societies become more productive, to appropriate that surplus, right? So that you get the rise of different forms of hierarchy and inequality within societies,
Yeah.
right? So no longer does everybody have to be a farmer. Everybody has to, chase the
Sure.
caribou or whatever. Instead, 80% of people can do that, and 20% of people can do other things, whether that's, keeping the numbers, or becoming warriors or priests or rulers or what have you. And so some people are now starting to appropriate surplus. They're using that surplus to project power and to entrench their ability to rule within society, right?
Yeah.
And so you start to get these hierarchical and unequal societies, and that advances through the course of the next several millennia, right? Such
Yeah.
that by 3000 BC, we see warring over lands in Mesopotamia. By the year zero, basically, the Romans have a property registry, kind of like a library, in which people are registering their property and they're disputing different things. And so, at this throughout this whole time period, also populations are growing, right? So there's
Yes,
increasing
of course.
pressure on the land,
Yeah.
and people are settling more and more and more on the land. And so they start to enclose land more. They start to, delineate property ownership, and eventually, by the 1500s, 1600s, and the like, we start to get things like the beginnings of modern property rights, right?
Yeah.
So, but that is a very recent invention in human history, and it's really has this very deep past.
Yeah, one of the things in your book that you didn't have in there, but having read this book that I just talked about, The Old Way, with Elizabeth Thomas, um, it's interesting because she makes the point of equality between the sexes in this little hunter-gatherer group, which, apropos of what you were saying, this was like 30 to 60 people that had been in the Kalahari. Best estimates by rock art and genetics these days place them there for the last 100,000 years, 80 for sure, maybe 100. That's a long time compared to all this other stuff you're talking about.
Really?
I mean, the modern era, if you want to say it started 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago with writing or whatever, it's like an eye blank. We haven't been doing any of this shit for more than 10 seconds. I mean, there is no such thing as ancient human history, not in the way we mean it. I mean, just in passing, I note that.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. All this stuff is very recent, and
Yeah,
it's
it's
been
2 minutes ago.
very
And that
fast.
includes religion and writing and,
Completely.
the whole bit.
Yeah.
But anyway, what I was trying to get to is that it seems to me that therein, with that change from the hunter-gatherer mode of being, where you don't own things, at least from her book, The Old Way, there was much more equality of the sexes in that, because they had very distinct jobs. The women were gathering and they were hunting for the things that you could dig out of the ground. The men were hunting with poisoned darts in her little group that she was with, but the women got to distribute the meat. And so they had a system to make you equal again.
Yeah.
And this had gone on for a long time. Like this is going for 80,000 years, let's say, and worked. Because how do we know that? Because they're still there.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean,
they survived doing this.
there's been some really interesting studies about the origins of the plow and how the plow is really what changed.
Yeah, and you have that in your book.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, it's in there. Yeah. So, the way in which human society started to farm and the labor intensiveness that was associated with using, the plow completely upended gender relationships within
totally.
societies, right? And so we kind of have these modern notions of what kind of gender should look like in the household, and they're really recent in human history.
Yeah, they are.
They're like you said, they're the blink of an eye, right? It
Yeah.
certainly was never like that previously.
Well, and
And
I think
so,
one of the misconceptions is somehow this is traditional, but it's not.
exactly. Yeah, no,
Our
it's not.
idea of manhood is not traditional, unless you
Yeah,
say traditional is 5,000 years old or, a little more than that.
yeah,
If you want to go to the hunter-gatherers that Elizabeth Marshall Thomas talks about, traditional is before all this. So the men and women, the division of labor is very equal at that point. Which, by the way, in her book, I know it's a footnote to what you're saying, but it had a big impact on fertility because the women aren't menstruating much. They're out there gathering and have two or three children because of the fact that their bodies are the bodies of long distance runners, basically,
that's right.
because that's how they spend their whole life is doing stuff.
Yeah. Yes, yes. So the invention, of the plow and settled agriculture and all that kind of thing. Yes, it completely changes fertility as well. So you get this
Yeah,
enormous boom in population growth. So it's that
yeah,
all of a sudden, by the year zero, you've got 200 billion people on the earth
yeah.
instead of what you had just a little bit before, which was 5 million people. So yes, that's right. It completely upends that. And we can think about that again and again when you think about different facets of modern society that are defining features, right? If you think about
Right.
race and the that you've got different races of people mixed together in certain
Sure.
places, and you have racism and the like. That never existed in hunter-gatherer societies. I
Right.
mean, people didn't have large societies. People didn't mix in that same way.
And you didn't
So
meet anybody else. You lived
yeah,
in your little
I mean,
corner and your hunter gathering was within a 100-mile radius because
yes,
that's, you
yeah.
weren't walking across the continent.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So a lot of these
I
things are
just want to
modern
interrupt and just
inventions.
say I'm talking to Mike Albertus. His newest book is Land Power: Who Has It and Who Doesn't, and How That Determines the Fate of Societies. And it's a really important book. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, it's kind of ripped from the headlines because the issues that you bring up about fairness and equity and all these other things are not only eternal; they become very political hot buttons. I said it
Yeah.
before. So let me dive back in here to the book itself because we're having too interesting a discussion, so I'm forgetting my questions here. You say, I think this comes from a later passage in the book, maybe at the end, but I've moved it up to the beginning. To change our world for the better now and to seed the consciousness that we will need to make a better future 50 or 100 years from now, when another unique moment of humanity on the land arrives, requires us to see land power for what it is and to learn how to use it for good. That is the mission of this book. So let's jump to something here and then we'll get into more of the book. Let's jump to what you mean by use it for the good. How do you define good? And I'm not talking about, morality, but what works and what doesn't, and what leaves us all in the best shape. Because you talk about land redistribution and you have the French Revolution. And of course, I can come back and say, yeah, well, what about the Great Terror? And you talk about how they took the
Hmm.
churches and they beheaded the aristocracy. And it's like, yeah, but they didn't stop there. Pretty soon they were beheading anybody that disagreed with them. So basically, every land distribution effort that's ever happened in the Soviet Union and the French Revolution, the big ones we know about, including the Norman Conquest, when they came in and took all the land from the Anglo-Saxons, killed the barons, stole their land, built castles, dominated it along with their construction of cathedrals, and that's whites doing this. It isn't a racial thing at all. It's just conquest. Um, the fact that you very honestly give the flip side to so many of these stories where someone's tried to do something different. I guess my first basic question to you is how can we do something that's good that isn't tainted by greed, passion, avarice, and just becomes another shtick the way the Stalinists did in Russia when, again, it's just another elite in charge of everything.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I guess if a student in your class was saying, okay, what's the real alternative that you've seen work somewhere that isn't, Bolivia, big strokes, how do we fix this? How do we fix this
Yeah.
this greed of land and ownership? And not we're not going back to hunter gatherers. There's going to be 10 billion of us, and then it's going to decline a little. In the meantime, if Mike's in charge, what's he do?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a few things I think that are critical to keep in mind as we go through this transition and we think about what does it mean to do this right, or what would be a good way to do this, right? So one is that land today is still the most valuable asset on Earth, valued somewhere around $200 trillion, more than anything else, more than all the tech companies combined, and everything else is still land. Land is still very central to our economies. It's central to identity, and the ways, like you said, in the examples that you gave, whether it's the Soviet Union, Russia, China, et cetera, I could give you, and there are many examples in the book of how societies have reshuffled lands in ways that have generated enduring social problems, as well as short-term dislocations, right? But there are also a lot of examples of countries that are today using land for the good in order to restore their environment, in order to generate greater development, to level the playing field in terms of opportunity and the like. And so that's what I really want to focus on in that. In
Can you
that
just
last,
give me a few examples
yeah.
of those so that, give me some examples of anything happening now that you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So, we already talked about the one in Bolivia, right? In terms of leveling
Sure.
kind of gender relationships.
Yeah.
I spent time in Patagonia, where there's the creation of a new national park in Patagonia called Patagonia National Park. For a
Sure.
long time, this was a kind of a pristine landscape. The Chilean government handed it out to private ranching sort of interests in the early 1900s in
Yeah.
order to settle the area, protect it against Argentina. It degraded the environment in a lot of ways, sort of changed hands over time. And recently, it was returned back into a national park, right? And so,
Mhm.
so that is sort of, in a time at which we're struggling with climate change and the loss of biodiversity and the like, we see elements of that sort of thing happening. And it doesn't need to be, just getting people off the land. There's a lot of
Sure.
ways in which this can be done with people on the land, like conservation easements and the like that are being used in the United States. I also spent time in South Africa, where the government is in an ongoing project to restore, return, millions of acres of land to people who were forcibly dispossessed from the land under apartheid, right? Which
Yeah.
is just, if we talked about 10,000 years ago being the blink of an eye, I mean, this is the not even a blink of an eye, right?
Yeah.
So, people are telling me stories about their parents and how they were, forced into trucks and trucked out, by the apartheid government off their land, and now they're receiving this land back, and the government is doing it in a way that is controversial and provocative, but fits squarely within the democratic system. So
Yeah.
they are paying landowners market value price for their land, and then they are transferring that land to people who are dispossessed from it. And in
Speaking
the
of the
case,
politics of the moment,
yes,
we
notwithstanding,
have JD Vance and Trump
yeah.
saying they can resettle some of these white farmers here, and you can come government stealing
Yeah,
your land.
which is just the farthest that could possibly be from the truth.
Yeah.
This notion of like the Zimbabwe style boogeyman, where hey, we just crucify all the white landowners and run them out.
Yeah.
That's not at all what's happening in South Africa. I mean,
Yeah.
I was talking to people, both white landowners who transfer this land as well as black recipients of this land work hand in hand with one another
Yeah.
to be productive, and have continued working together for the course of decades
Yeah.
to actually make a go on the land, and they're doing a great job of it, right? There are other examples of places like Peru, where I've done work in the highlands of Peru, and the government there is working on granting property rights to small farmers that have been marginalized since basically the colonial era, and that's empowering them to make investments and to
Yeah.
and to get make partnerships with people to produce more. So there's a lot of things that are being done now, and what I would emphasize is that even these things are going to change radically in the next 50 to
Sure.
100 years because, like you said, populations are going to 10 billion before the end of the century, but then they're probably going to decline.
Yeah, which you talk
Um,
about in your book, and we've done a lot
yeah.
of I say programs. I don't know. I must have delusions of being on a TV show here,
Uh-huh.
podcasts. We've been doing a lot of things with various demographers, British
Right.
demographers and others, like Moreland, who wrote Tomorrow's People, everybody who's doing all these statistics that you
Yeah.
sort of cite.
Yep.
And that's another, hey, we've only been here 10,000 years as we are. Here comes the next wave. Guess what? The
Exactly.
population's going to drop now. So much for Paul Ehrlich and his population bomb.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Populations are going to drop. They're probably going to drop pretty dramatically. That's going to totally rewire,
Everything. Yep.
everything. I mean, how, cities, right? I mean, I grew up on the outskirts of Detroit. I mean, Detroit's population now is a little bit more than a third of what it was in the
Sure.
1950s. What that has done to the city in terms of services,
Yeah.
the ability to flourish as a city, it's been a very big struggle within the city of Detroit. I mean, there's also, of course, a big
Yeah.
racial element there as well, but thinking about how that might work in other parts of the world that are going
Mhm.
to be shrinking, it's going to totally rewire our relationship with the land.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely. I
and
lived in South Africa for a year, by the way. Back in
mm,
the days, I was working in
okay,
Hollywood when I shot two feature films out there, one in South Africa and one in Namibia, which in
yeah,
those days was run by the South Africans. And this was in the mid to late 1980s. So I was there during the apartheid era, living in a quote white neighborhood. But what was interesting to me is our crew was mixed race, so it was about half black, half white. And by that point, the people we were working with already knew the handwriting was on the wall in terms of the
yeah,
apartheid regime. And so my kids, who were high school age and who we took out of school here, went to an illegal mixed race school. And guess who else was in the mixed race school? Some of the apartheid leaders from the government who
wow,
wanted their kids to know some people from the black elite because they saw
yeah,
what was coming.
interesting.
And I talked to a South African the other day, I think on this program, and after the show we were comparing notes, and he knew the name of the school. I think it was called Woodmead or something. But anyway,
Yeah,
so I saw some of that, and then of course we were very aware in South Africa that whatever we want to do here, we being the white South Africans, let's not do what was happening in Zimbabwe, which had
right.
totally derailed everything
Yeah,
and was nothing to do with what they're doing in South Africa now. And of
that's
course,
right.
JD Vance and these guys are just out and out lying by
Yeah,
conflating
that's
the two.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, nothing at all is going on like occurred in Zimbabwe, and yeah, and South Africa has used that as a cautionary tale of something to
Yeah,
avoid, right? Just
yeah,
that by fiat, let's just seize everybody's land and run them out, and that's it, right?
yeah.
Through violence and the like, that has not been happening at all in South Africa, and so they've been sort of a model for how to do this in a very um, measured
In a
fashion,
measured way,
right? In a
yeah.
very measured way.
Let me get to a sort of a philosophical question, and then I want to get back into some of the details on your book. And by the way, again, we're talking with Mike, who has written this incredible book called Land Power, Who Has It? Who doesn't, and how that determines the fate of societies. And as I said, a lot of this, by implication, is ripped from the headlines. We've just been talking about something right now in terms of redistribution of land. But I sort of have a philosophical question for you, and this isn't loaded. I'm not fishing for anything. This is a real question. Forget. This is just a question. Um, but in reading your book, one thing jumped out at me, which we've already discussed, and that is, wow, we've been here 10 seconds. I mean, this whole thing you're talking about is only 10,000 years old and really only 5,000 years old. And before that, it was a whole different thing. You know, most of human history isn't this. So that's sort of one thought. The other is a philosophical question about land ownership and human nature, because it seems to me that whether it's fixing the environment or gender equality or racism or fairness or not grabbing Greenland because we have nukes and they don't, whatever you look at, one of the things you have to ask yourself about, and this is a real question, um, what is human nature? So human nature obviously didn't handle the plow well. Human nature hasn't handled a lot of shit well. We haven't handled 8 billion people on Earth well. The Earth hasn't handled us well because we've fucked it up totally. So I have a kind of an overarching question that I ask myself all the time in terms of my own work and even my life and my investment in just living. Um, at one point, I don't fault your book for this at all because I'd do the same thing. But I have a question, and that is anything finally good possible in terms of lasting solutions for any of what I would call the human proclivity to violence, to chaos, to greed, to accumulation of wealth, to unfairness? You know,
Mhm.
somebody with, you know, $40 billion and some other guys living in a tent on the street. I mean, this is the world we're
Yeah,
in now.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And just for you as a human being, because I'm so interested in you because of what you read, where does Mike come down on just the human condition? Like, how do we see this? Is this original sin? I mean, I'm not
Hmm, hmm.
pegging you for
Yeah,
that,
I mean,
but what's the deal here? Because we haven't handled any of this well.
right. No, we haven't. We have not handled this well. And part of the book, kind of the meat of the book, is through this the lens of what I call this Great Reshuffle, right? The last couple hundred years, where
Yeah.
all of a sudden it has come to a head that there's now explosive population growth. We've got more than 1 billion people on the planet. We've got states that are becoming ever more powerful, ever more capable of moving resources around within societies and figuring out who's in their societies and guiding doing all the things that states do in terms of projecting authority. And then we have social conflict over
Yeah.
these very deep inequalities that were created in the course of the last couple millennia, right? These
Yeah.
hierarchies, the empires that existed at the time, and feudalism and all these sorts of things, and all this comes to explode in the
Yeah.
last couple hundred years, and it explodes in dramatic fashion, right? So that all these
Yeah.
countries are reshuffling land in different ways, and sometimes at a really massive scale. And for me, more directly to your question, it comes down a lot to sort of the scale at which you want to think about how can we get things right, as well as the tricky realities of kind of politics within social groupings of people, right? As a political scientist, I understand all these problems that arise within societies when you have inequalities, when you have some people ruling and not others, when there's various disparities, feelings of unfairness, cultural difference, and the like. It becomes very difficult to manage that very well at a large scale, right? But there are a lot of examples of at a much smaller scale in which societies or communities are doing a good job of handling different things, right? So if you think about, for example, and there are examples of this in the book, in Australia, let's say, right,
Yeah.
where they're struggling with this history of dispossessing, Aboriginals from the land, Aboriginal communities from the land,
Sure.
and they're trying to figure out, how do we rectify that past, right? And how do we try and repair some of these communities that were destroyed and torn up, and creating partnerships between government, private parties, and Aboriginal communities to co-steward land and create relationships that generate revenue to help reconstitute those communities, but at the same time open up lands for public recreation and preservation and the like. So you can see these kinds of solutions that do arise when people are willing to work together, and when they see that a better outcome can come when in fact they do work together, that it's better for everybody, right?
Yeah.
And there are examples of that, and but I would say that they're difficult to scale up, right? But
They
that
are.
what
Yeah.
I think we need to do in the next decades, and in this century, is to figure out how we can scale some of those things up in a much more effective way, such that we can deal with this new reshuffle that's coming on the land, right?
Well, and the reshuffle being that we're going to have a population decline, which
That's right.
basically deals an entirely new hand to everybody.
Completely new hand. And at the same time, of course, the climate is going to be changing. And so
Yes.
where people are living on Earth is going to change, right? There's going to be increased, flows of immigration
Sure.
and the like. Some countries will shut their doors, others will open their doors and take it as
Yeah.
an opportunity. And so that's going to be happening at the same time at which we have these other big dynamics on the land.
Yeah, there's a little bit of your book I want you to read out loud if you don't mind. And I'm
Sure.
sorry, I read the Kindle, so the pages may be different, but I think it's from around pages 24 to 25, where you talk
Okay.
about your own family. My own family history in
Yeah.
part traces this pattern. Can you find that with any ease and read it? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah. No, I've got it right here.
Great. Well, hey, and everybody, we didn't rehearse this. So as they say in Massachusetts, Mike is wicked smart because he knew where it was.
So my own family history in part traces this pattern. This is talking about different patterns, historical patterns of land
Exactly.
ownership. And my family, traces part of this, this kind of lord-peasant landholding relationship that prevailed in Russia, historical Russia, Prussia, a lot of different parts of the world. So I say, as well as I should say some of the settler sort of reforms that occurred in the United States. So my maternal ancestors left Freiburg in what was then Baden, a territory within the German Confederation, in 1820, and sailed to Philadelphia. From there, they trekked to northwestern Pennsylvania, where they bought 170 acres of unimproved land from the Holland Land Company money and set to farming. Within a few generations, they became store owners and engineers. A few eventually moved to the Detroit area to work in the auto industry and for General
Yeah.
Electric. And then, so that's kind of the settler side, right? And then the other side, kind of the Lord peasant side of things, on my father's side, ancestors on my father's side were less fortunate. They struggled under the thumb of Lord peasant landholding for generations in southern and eastern Poland. Southern Poland was long a poor and economically isolated outpost of the Habsburg Empire, and the Habsburgs abolished serfdom following a wave of revolutions that swept Europe in 1848, and peasants came to own plots of their own land. An uprising in eastern Poland against Russia delivered farmers from serfdom shortly after in 1864. But the shadow of generations of serfdom was dark. Grinding poverty persisted, and the brutality of World War I drove my grandfather and his father to migrate to the United States. They soon made their way to Detroit, the other one taking a job driving a metro train. So that's some of my own kind of, personal.
Sure. And I love that. I like that you interjected that.
Yeah.
Let me just mention one thing. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read, which kind of riffs off my commentary stuff that I do on Substack. It Has to Be Said. And we would like to make the book our book club offering for June, if that's okay.
That would be great. I'd love
that. Gives us a chance to re-promote it, maybe have you back. And so June is when we will offer Mike's book, Land Power. And that's the book we're talking about now. So I had a kind of a philosophical question before, and I'm going to throw another one at you.
Yeah.
And again, there's no hook in this, but in the context in which we live now, obviously, there's no way you can't talk about race and gender in this book, because it's one of the effects of how land was used, in the same way you can't avoid wealth and poverty, landowners, and all the rest of it. So this book isn't really about class, gender, wealth, and there's not a sort of a feminist hook in this, and whatever it may be, but it's unavoidable. However, in that context, I have a general question that I would pose to any of my friends who teach anywhere. The sort of scuttlebutt on left-wing institutions in America. And my son went to the University of Chicago. I love the University of Chicago. Nothing implied here. But it seems to me that just like a few minutes ago, we were talking about the general human condition, not black, white, but all of us. And we're talking about hunter-gatherers of whatever race they were did better before we invented the plow. That's all of us. Do you think that there is an absence in your book of examples of the fact that when it comes to land grabs, for instance, like the Norman Conquest in 1066, in which the entire Anglo-Saxon hierarchy was disenthroned, murdered, and replaced by a completely different set of people who had their own roots in Norse, cultures, and then, earlier than that had gone to France and so forth. You don't have that example in your book, and I'm not saying you should have, but it seems to me that a lot of the discourse I hear, whether it's about the protests against the Palestinians being massacred, whatever it may be, there's always somehow this idea somewhere in there that is certainly a point the right wing makes and the Trumpers make, and that is, hey, why are you always picking on the white guys? Everybody does this. And of course, that also extends to the Native Americans who were here killing off all the large mammals in our culture before any white people got there. In other words, the first thing they did is kill all the animals that were big enough to chase down and slow. And so by the time white people got here, everything was gone, except bears and wolves when it came to our predators. Again, it's a real question here. Don't you think that the human condition is such that when the left or the right concentrates on one ethnic set of sins, if you want to put it this way, first of all, that's very modern history in the sense we talked about it before. That's like right now, because it's 5,000 years, that's it. But secondly, it sort of ducks the bigger question, and that is, why is everybody like this? And in terms of human nature, because I think you mentioned various cultures and religions, but I think one of the people don't want to be called Islamophobic or something, and so there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction against, for instance, talking in detail about the conquest of North Africa by the Arabs who came pouring out of the desert. and conquered by the sword. They didn't convert anybody on the basis of ideas, and they did the same thing in Southern Europe. And then, of course, there was the big pushback with Charles Martel and the rest, and then the Crusades. But it just seems that when people pick examples, they'd rather talk about the Crusades than the conquest of Southern Europe by the Saracens, who were all pirates, by the way, whether they were Muslims or not. So I want to challenge you a little bit and just say, hey, it's really complicated. And the default position in a lot of the academic community seems to be what the white people have done wrong. And my question is just, isn't just this the human condition? Um, and I'm not espousing a point of view. I'm just asking you a question.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's no question that that these patterns of conquest, oppression, dispossession, etc., are you see them again and again and again throughout human history
Yeah,
and across different societies, far from strictly being relegated only to, the white societies dominating other,
yeah,
non-white societies or indigenous societies, right? I mean, and many of these, a number of these are in the book when you think about these sort of land reshuffles, right?
yeah. And
Whether
that's
it's,
why I like the term reshuffle, because
yeah,
it's innocuous. I mean, it really describes what's going on. It doesn't have an angle.
yeah. I mean, if you think about, what Mao and the communists did within China,
Sure.
that is a form of, ultimately it became through collectivization and the like, a form of dispossession, oppression, domination
And
that,
mass murder of your own people.
yeah,
They're not
completely.
in Africa. They're just doing it at home.
That's right. That's right. And so that has happened in many societies across human history. And in fact, in like I'm not entirely sure of all the details in my own family story, but I was trying to, I mentioned I just read that passage. I said, part of my family came over from what is now Germany, went to Western Pennsylvania. From what I understand, how did William Penn get that land? From what I understand, there was conflict between Native American communities in part over that land, and
Sure.
one group basically sold it to William Penn without it, in fact, being theirs.
Yeah.
And there's constantly warring and conflict between social groupings. What I
Yeah.
think is, where the contemporary political moment fits in is
Mm.
with trying to grapple with a very narrow but consequential and important, chapter in this
Sure.
broader book, right? Which is the fact that Europe was a very special place. Europe was a tinderbox. Everybody was at war with everybody. Everybody
Yeah.
was killing each other. But then they also decided to branch out, right, and to go conquer elsewhere. And so you
Yeah.
happen to have Europeans that conquered, India and Africa and Latin America and the United States, what became the United States, etc. And so you have that as well, which is kind of lacquered over all these other complicated,
Sure.
inter-ethnic disputes, right? And so I'm completely with you that there are many examples of societies that are living in peace and harmony with one another and with neighbors, but there are also many, many, many
Yeah,
examples
absolutely.
of societies going after one another, doing it internally that have absolutely nothing to do with race, or in which the racial component is flipped on its head, or has nothing to do with whiteness.
Yeah, but also, there's attending things, and this isn't what your book is about, but again, similar point here. And that is, for instance, the word slave is derived from the word Slav, because everybody, starting with the Romans, was raiding the Slavic countries and hauling off white slaves. 10% of Englishmen, not black people from Africa, 10% of Englishmen were slaves before the Norman conquest. So after 1066, that started to change a little bit, but before that, and these slaves weren't from somewhere else.
Yeah.
They'd somehow become slaves in there, and then they were selling their own people to Islamic slave traders that were then taking people to their settlements on North Africa.
Yeah.
This is a very, we have an ugly history as humans.
That's
And
right.
I think that if you asked your average American college kid of whatever color about the slave trade, they immediately think of Africans being brought to America.
Mhm.
Actually, compared to the international slave trade that had gone on forever everywhere, mainly of Slavic people being hauled off to all parts of Europe, and then Europeans selling their own people to other places. And every single conquest ended with looting, rape, killing, burn the town, take the women and children, and then haul off anybody that you can sell into the slave trade. And this was across the board. You know, I just wish the institution of slavery was taught a little more accurately in terms of not always being reduced to the American history of race, because that was one of the most horrible slave trades in the world. But again, let's honestly deal with the human condition. This isn't
Right.
white guys doing particularly bad things. This is everybody, including white guys capturing other white guys from the neighboring town and turning them
Yeah.
into slaves in the United Kingdom, in England. I
Right.
mean, we don't think of that, and it's
Yeah.
not taught. Or maybe, am I making this shit up? Have I been reading too
No,
much
I mean, I think
Daily
this is
Mail?
broader part and parcel of, what you think about as, um, you could call this, you could call aspects of this. This is very much tied into, empire, conquest, expansionism and the like. So I teach a class for, in southern Mexico now and then, a study abroad class for U Chicago.
Yeah,
And, it's been fascinating over the years to learn about pre-Hispanic cultures in Mexico and the conquest that was going on, for example, by the Aztecs to, whether it's the, attempts to conquest or attempts to conquer, the Zapotec of Oaxaca or many other, local, smaller scale, communities, ethnicities, tribes, and the like, and oftentimes done through exactly the sorts of dynamics that you're talking about, right? Through violence, through the capture of people, through the use of those people later on as slaves. That happens again and again and again. I mean, I think in the United States we have this tendency to do a lot of kind of navel gazing, right, and focus on the United States. And there is a good reason why we talk about, slavery in the United States and what it looked like, as well as the dispossession of Native Americans, because that
sure.
occurred for, for a very long period of time. It affected millions of people. We're still living and breathing the consequences of it in so many ways in which our society is, functions and is organized today, that it's crucial to talk about. But I'm with you that this is not something that is unique, right? That somehow, only this society or only, European societies have engaged in this kind of conquest or the like. That is demonstrably false. I mean, that has been going on, like you say, in human history for very long periods of time.
Yeah, I don't know what your religious background is, if any, and I'm not, not the point here. I come from an evangelical background, but I want to ask you, did you grow up with any kind of religious instruction, moral framework that you carry forward, or are you out of that, or you never were there? I'm always
Yeah, I
curious
grew
because of
up.
where I come from.
Yeah, I grew up in a strong kind of Catholic family, and going to church every week, going to religious
Yeah.
education, doing all that kind of stuff, right? I don't do that as much anymore, but I grew up in that framework, and I had a lot of Catholic friends growing up, not exclusively, but mostly Christian friends growing up, and there was a very strong moral framework around that, right? And
Yeah.
and it's been interesting as I've grown older and I've thought about, and I've come to understand to a much greater degree the world and the politics that we live in and how to understand societies and how societies function and relate to one another, to go back and read some of these texts and think about them through that different sort of lens, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I did grow up in a different community than you did, in a different framework, but also in some ways, I don't know if it was equally strong as yours, but it was a very strong one.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife, Jeannie, grew up in California and went to Roman Catholic churches, and her dad was an Irish Catholic and so forth. So we sort of have that in our family experience. The reason I ask is because there's a book that I've mentioned to other guests that I would also mention to you, called Dominion: How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, by Tom Holland, who's one of the premier British Roman historians, not Roman historians, historians of Rome, and has a really great podcast with Dominic Sandbrook. And he's also a historian, called The Rest is History. And Holland has written a very interesting book to me, because I describe myself as an atheist who prays. In other words, I'm a shitty atheist because I have that Christian background and I'm still sort of religious in my instincts, but on an in an intellectual framework, as on any given day, I don't think God exists. So I'm not sure who I'm praying to, but I get up every morning and pray anyway because there are people I love and I want to give thanks for and protect. But Holland's written an interesting book called Dominion that has, I think, a direct impact on your subject, how the Christian Revolution remade the world. And his thesis, just in a nutshell, it's a big, thick book, and it's well written, is this, and that is that we assume certain values as if they've come from outer space by osmosis. But actually, even those of us who are atheists or feminists or in the gay pride movement, all of us have been influenced by a certain idea of civil liberties and human rights
Mhm.
that in our culture only have one source, and that is Christianity. Not in the sense Christians were always good. They were rapists, they were enslavers, they were kings, they were property, all the people doing the things you talk about in your book. But that said, he feels that there's a sort of a cheat here going on, and that is, and he describes himself as secular, but that philosophy is not properly credited with the revolutionary slow motion change it brought. So, for instance, to apply it to your book, you're talking about doing the right thing. And Tom would come back with something like, I say Tom, I don't know him personally, but I've listened to his podcast, so he's Tom to me now. But he would come back with a statement of, okay, well, like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, fine. They want to pull this out of thin air, as it were, or from the French Revolution or Voltaire or Rousseau or somebody. But if you look at Voltaire and Rousseau, what they're basically calling the church to do is to be true to its highest ideals. So
Mhm.
they haven't invented their philosophy out of thin air. Even in reacting to something, they're still basically reacting to Jesus's teaching or St. Paul saying that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Gentile, free nor whatever. And I'm just curious whether you've ever given that any thought in terms of the value, the values we kind of assume in all these discussions of how land is used or women's rights or whatever. Um, Again, I think there's a sort of a secular assumption in perhaps more in academic communities, maybe less, I don't know. But there's a failure to understand that, when you strip away the sort of framework that was assumed in Christendom, for better or worse, you know, how do you come up with the value package
Mhm.
to then call out Christians, or anyone else when they behave according to something that's very in antithesis to that?
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
don't know if you'd give any thought to that because you come from a
Yeah.
Catholic background.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, there's the there's the practice on the one hand, and that has to be divorced in many ways, as you say, from the beliefs, right, and the teachings.
Yeah,
And even within the teachings, there are so many different counter currents,
yeah,
right?
of course there are.
Like you said, taking it to at its highest ideals. And I think in many ways, I am, my own kind of moral framework is informed by that and
Yeah,
informed by that upbringing, right? That notion of, giving everyone that everyone is in some sense kind of created equal and should have an opportunity to
yeah,
live and flourish in a way that reflects their human nature, right? And that
yeah,
reflects their, the inherent sort of freedoms that come with being a person on this earth, a human on this earth, right? And what does that mean? How can we create a society, a politics, et cetera, that in some ways respects that and enables people to flourish and make decisions about what they want to do in their own lives, right?
mm,
And so, yes, that framework I think is there for me. And I mean, we could talk about whether that, how that's used in different ways in different places. Of course, it's used in very different ways. But yes, that does definitely inform my own kind of work, and it informs my own kind of thoughts and ideas about how we want to think about society.
yeah. You brought up South Africa, and I just thought I'm just thinking out loud here, but that certainly informed Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu in the way they tried to resolve the apartheid situation. The reason there wasn't a bloodbath and why they're trying to equitably redistribute land without the kind of wholesale chaos that happened in Zimbabwe. I mean, they really did start from a basic set of presuppositions that were really not just vaguely sort of somehow rooted into Christianity, but were very definitely rooted into this idea of, equality combined with mercy and forgiveness and so forth. I mean, I think South Africa, that there it was deliberate and on purpose, and they said
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. Yes. No, there's no question that the church and religiosity played a very important role in,
Yeah.
the transition from apartheid to democracy, and the approach that the new democratic government has taken more or less ever since, right? In terms of
Yeah.
this sort of measured pace of reforms, trying to generate consensus, not overstepping boundaries, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I have a slightly different point of view to bookend. I talked about Tom Holland's book Dominion, and then the one I talked about before, The Way, the Old Way, talking about the Kung, what were called the Bushmen in the Kalahari. My view is a little different. I mean, this is totally off the wall, but just for what it's worth, so you can go away and say, yeah, Frank really is crazy. I think the only reason the teaching of Jesus and Paul, when it came to their good stuff, we'll leave aside hellfire for a minute and talk about the meek will inherit the earth is kind of a exact opposite of the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
And Jesus won, by the way. The Roman Empire went away. And you go to the Pantheon in Rome and there's crucifixes all over it. It's still a Roman building, but the church took it.
Yeah.
But my view is that the teachings of Jesus and Paul and the idea of equality and all these other things would not have resonated if it wasn't for the fact that deep in our evolutionary past we have this idea that worked. And there's actually a book by that title by Brian Woods and let's see, Brian, is it Heron Woods? But anyway, called the Survival of the Friendliest, in which they argue that through their research at the Canine Research Center in Duke University, they've come to this idea that the reason dogs are so successful as opposed to wolves that neared extinction, and the reason humans survived and were not Neanderthals, was that the people who did best, and this fits with your book, are the ones that understood that cooperation and survival depend on this. The friendliest shall survive, and the most belligerent do not, because it takes a village. We're all in cooperation. And I think for me personally, when I try to figure out now, why do the words of Jesus resonate and why did Jesus and Paul win? And it became this very attractive religion that, in spite of enslaving people and taking land and all the rest, still had, they still had something to say and changed the whole of world culture, if by imitation and osmosis, if not directly, is because it harked back to something that predates the plow, if I can put it in terms of your book. That's in all of us anyway. We all really do want to get along at some point. I don't know. Does that resonate with you at all? This is just me spouting off for a minute.
Yeah, no, I think that it does. I think that it does. I think that, on the one hand, I think that for me, one of the things that's always fascinated me, and then in fact, kind of turned me into a political scientist, or in other words, made me want to study that, was the discrepancy or the difference between, if you go to anywhere in the world, right, and you talk to people, for the most part, you're going to get smiles and stories, and and connection.
Yeah.
And people will connect with you through their family histories, through their food, through whatever it might be, and they want to share, right?
Yep.
And then when you start to scale people up, and then you have different societies, and then you want to have them, live in peace and harmony with one another, then things become a bit more difficult, right?
Yep.
And so, what is it that how this scaling problem, right?
Yep.
The scaling problem going from interpersonal relationships in which people exhibit typically these desires to be, cooperative and sharing and the like, to, society-wide issues where you start to see, warring and conflict and, domination and the like. There's this big chasm between those. And for me, that's always been a fascinating, discrepancy and something to really think about and investigate. And so what you see in this book, Land Power, is really about, at the society level, how do we get these things, right? Because in the society level, we've done very poorly when it comes to dealing with, who should get who should get what, and how they should get it. And if we're going to take some things from some people, how should that be done? We've done a very bad job with that.
Yeah.
And I think that there are models at a very local level of how to do that much better. And so again, this question is how to scale up that.
Yeah. Well, listen, I really appreciated this. I'm going to sort of just recap what we're doing here, and then I'm going to ask you for a favor after I recap and say goodbye to you. Stay on for a second and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, because he's going to ask you to get the right links to your book and everything, and about the book club in June that we're going to do your book,
Okay, great.
Land Power. And he's also going to ask you for suggestions of anybody else we ought to be talking to.
Great.
Another guest, could be an author, could be your best student, could be a friend, could be, whoever.
Great. Okay.
So just stick around for a second.
Good.
So Land Power, who has it, who doesn't, and how that determines the fate of societies will be on our book club in June. And Mike, Albertus. You've been great, and I so enjoyed this conversation. I had many more notes to get into, but unfortunately, what you were saying was too interesting to dive in. But I did get you to read a bit, so that was good.
I had a great, it was a very interesting conversation. I'm motivated by it. It's kind of energizing, right? To think through a lot of these issues from these
Yeah, me
perspectives. So
too.
thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, and anytime we can, speaking as a mobster, anytime we can do something for you.
Awesome. I love it.
Okay, being a powerless, mobster. But anyway,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
please let us know and stay on and talk to Ernie here for a second. And listen, thank you so much. And thank you for writing a book that I could understand and really enjoy. And you bring up huge questions. And you didn't know you were writing a rip from the headlines book, but you did.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Hey, this has been great. Thanks a lot.
Okay. All right.